Hey guys, last month we started going through the Silmarillion, and we kicked things off with the prologue, which is a long excerpt from an even longer letter that Tolkien wrote to a prospective publisher explaining a little bit about what the book was about and what his goals were for it. Today we're actually going to get into the narrative by looking at the Ainulindalë. I'm proceeding under the fairly safe assumption, I believe, that most of the people listening have already read this strange little chunk of text. If for some reason you haven't, you should probably stop now and go read it and then come back. So I won't worry too much or spend too much time on summarizing the actual content. It's Middle-earth's creation myth. It describes how the world and the universe were created by a very mysterious, singular, presumably omnipotent divine figure known as Eru, the One, or Iluvatar, the Allfather. And he decides to create the universe through these pseudo-angelic beings called the Ainur. He declares to them a theme. They all begin to sing variations on that theme. One of them, Melkor, decides to deviate from the theme. This is known as the Discord. This is the explanation for how evil and pain and suffering enter the world. But the Discord cannot ultimately overcome the original theme. It ends up getting woven into it. The music stops. Eru turns the music into a vision of a world that somehow ties together all of these different ideas of all of the Ainur into a unified creation. The Ainur look upon it. They say that they want it to be real. Eru makes it real, and then he allows or invites some of them to enter into the world and take part in it. And the Ainur who do enter are known as the Valar and Maiar. Of course, Melkor goes along too, and this is how the world comes into existence. So that's basically the plot. That's what happens. What's less clear than what happens, at least to me, is what even is the Ainulindalë as a text. How are we to approach it? How does it fit into the rest of the writings? What are we to make of it? And can we isolate or identify any of the qualities that give it its peculiar character, both stylistically and in terms of its being an artificial myth, but one that could be evaluated alongside what I like to call naturally occurring myths. So the first point to make, maybe an obvious one, is that though it is published in the volume titled The Silmarillion, and is the first part of that book that most of us read, and obviously it's very relevant to the rest of the events in the book, the Ainulindalë is not part of the account formally titled Quenta Silmarillion. In fact, in my big fat volume, opposite the title page, there's a page that says J.R.R. Tolkien, Quenta Silmarillion, the history of the Silmarils, together with Ainulindalë, the music of the Ainur, and Valaquenta, account of the Valar, to which is appended Akalabeth, the downfall of Numenor, and of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. So there's the Quenta Silmarillion, which kind of is the core and the heart and the largest part of the book, but then there's 4 other texts or documents, narratives, I'm not even sure how to really refer to them, that are clearly related and were published together, but are all kind of their own entity. And I think that's particularly important to recognize when you're looking at the Ainulindalë, because while the Quenta Silmarillion is somewhat notoriously kind of a Frankenstein's monster of different texts from different eras stitched together with great editorial effort, the Ainulindalë is quite unique in that you can actually trace out a pretty complete lineage for it. It was actually written out in complete and relatively recognizable form during the Book of Lost Tales era. And then each subsequent version was apparently written with reference to the one that preceded it. So yes, it does evolve and change over the decades, but you can trace those changes pretty easily. But not only that, which is unique enough in itself, you can trace phrases and images and sentences even that survived from that earliest draft passed down through successive copies and versions and are still present in the very latest Ainulindalë. And what that suggests to me, that pattern of revision, is Tolkien approaching this document less as a narrative or a history, and almost more as a poem or a poetic work. Which brings me to my next observation, which has to do with titles and subtitles. Seems like a reach maybe, but hear me out. So one of the characteristics that you find Tolkien spending a lot of time on and giving a lot of attention to in his unpublished, unfinished drafts and assorted writings is the frame narrative. The idea that somehow the reader was going to be coaxed into approaching the material of the Quenta Silmarillion, etc., from the perspective of this is a history compiled from different sources by the elves and primarily concerning the elves and their deeds, recounted to humans who then handed down translations and interpretations of these histories. This is the whole idea of, for example, the Book of Lost Tales, in which the tales themselves, the Ainulindalë being the first of the Lost Tales, are nested within this account of a human adventurer who has somehow stumbled upon the fairy realm. That's fairy with an E. Now, in the Silmarillion, Christopher Tolkien has largely done away with this, probably because it was just too confusing. It would screw the pacing up. His audience is aware that these are unfinished, posthumously published, somewhat disparate documents. So in a way, reality itself offers enough of a frame narrative for the audience to approach them. But we do find nods to that idea in the titles of the works themselves, which Tolkien would have given them, and in the subtitles, which are translations. So the Quenta Silmarillion, for instance, is literally the history of the Silmarils. The Vala Quenta is given the subtitle, a little bit more elaborate, account of the Valar and Maiar according to the lore of the Eldar. So a bit of a nod here to the supposed second-hand nature of all of this information. But the Ainulindalë is just the Ainulindalë. The subtitle is a direct translation, the music of the Ainur. It's not the account of the music of the Ainur. There's no Quenta involved. It is the music of the Ainur. It's almost as if the Valar said, look, we can't really explain or describe what happened because it's almost by definition indescribable. The best we can do is this story that replicates as closely as is possible the experience of what it was like. So to my mind, that makes this much less of a pseudo-historical chronicle or even legend, and something much more like a vision or a piece of music or a poem. It's meant to be more of a sensory or aesthetic experience than a logical or analytical one. The medium is the message, that kind of a thing. And so while I don't know that Tolkien would have considered this a prose poem or used those words, I think it makes sense that he took such care in revising to retain and enhance the specific sentences and phrases, because I think he meant for the Ainulindalë to evoke much more of an emotional reaction than the more rational one that you would get in a more linear, narrative-focused piece. So other concerns and points of interest. It seemed, based on the feedback I got, that people were more interested in potentially exploring some of those stylistic qualities that Tolkien was apparently at pains to preserve, and also any potential points where we could detect influence from other similar origin stories and creation myths. Again, from the prologue, we know that one of Tolkien's goals was to create a mythology and a legend cycle that would fit in with the English literary tradition and redress what he saw as that lack. So before I attempt to tackle those topics, a disclaimer that I am much more qualified to comment on, for example, the evolution of elven names than I am to make points of comparative mythology or ancient literary techniques. I did try to do some decent research to make sure I wasn't at least completely off base, but I would encourage everyone very much to view these as potential topics for further investigation with input from people who have a degree of knowledge more specialized than I currently possess. So with that out of the way, again, taking a sort of two-pronged approach to see how Tolkien created the effects that he did within the Ainulindalë and what he potentially was drawing on. I'm looking at two different traits. One is the style in which it was written, and the other is its actual content. So regarding the style, one of the comments made about the Silmarillion generally is that it's like the Bible of Middle-earth, or that it's very biblical in style, or Christopher Tolkien relates this anecdote in one of his forewords that somebody complained to him, actually wrote him a letter complaining that, I can't read this Silmarillion stuff, it's written like it's the Old Testament, which one gets the sense that Chris thought that was kind of funny. But most of the time, what I think people are getting at when they call it biblical, apart from its content, is just that it's written in a very remote, consciously archaic, old-fashioned, formal, analytic style that most people most readily associate with certain translations of the Bible. However, the Ainulindalë in particular uses some specific techniques that I think I can argue are drawn, at least in part, from the Book of Genesis. And this is an argument that's a bit more challenging to support than it maybe appears at first. Because while I am in no way a biblical scholar or an expert in defunct languages, I am aware that none of the books of the Bible were originally composed in English. Most of us only know them in translation. Oftentimes, translation several degrees removed from the original material. So not only do you have to argue that there are sufficient similarities to suggest influence, but also that those very stylistic hallmarks were not simply due to the whim of a particular translator. So the first question I had to figure out was, can we determine what version or versions of Genesis Tolkien might have plausibly been most familiar with, which required a scooch of research. And the most reasonable-sounding surmise that I came across was that he would most likely have been familiar with the Vulgate, which would have been the Latin translation. As far as vernacular versions go, when he was growing up, the official Catholic translation would have been the Douay Rheims. And though he likely wouldn't have used the King James version personally, of course it's an Anglican translation, it's kind of there in the name, King James, one assumes that he must have been familiar with it simply because of its popularity, its ubiquity, and its tremendous influence on English literature. Now, again, in no way qualified to comment on this seriously, but my cursory examination of the King James and the Douay Rheims first couple of chapters of Genesis seemed relatively similar stylistically. I'm not sufficiently advanced in Latin prose to comment intelligently on the style hallmarks of the Vulgate, so if that question really intrigues you, then you're probably best served by, again, seeking out someone cleverer than I. But now that we can at least make a surmise as to what texts Tolkien would have been using, the next question then is, how was he using them? Obviously, the practice of his faith was important to him, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was A, regularly reading the Bible at all, or B, that if he was he doing it with the same kind of care and sensitivity to literary concerns, questions of structure and style and imagery and all that, which you would bring to a close examination of a piece of art or literature that you weren't necessarily approaching from a spiritual perspective. And again, it seems that the answer here is yes. For one thing, you would have to assume that major historical translations from Latin and Greek would have come up once or twice, perhaps, in his training as a linguist and a classicist. But apart from even just the reasonable inferences, we know Tolkien was actually consulted on biblical translation when the Jerusalem Bible was being compiled and published. And according to him, specifically consulted on matters of style. Side note, something kind of fun that I found during my digging around on this topic was that Tolkien's original draft of his translation of the Book of Jonah was published in 2009, I think originally in Journal of Inkling Studies, and then I've heard that maybe at least parts of it have made it into other journals potentially. As far as I can see, they're all behind paywalls, so sorry I didn't go and look through it personally. But if you're inclined, it might be kind of interesting to see. So having established relatively satisfactory answers to all of those potential objections, the particular stylistic quality that I picked out, that all of the texts have in common as far as I can tell, and that I think is responsible for that, quote, biblical feel that people get when they start reading the Ainulindalë, is the use of parataxis, or a paratactic style or structure. And what is parataxis exactly? I am so glad you asked. So, a paratactic style is achieved by stacking a bunch of independent clauses or even phrases together, either just side by side with no connection or connected with coordinating conjunctions but not subordinating ones. And what this means is that each of those phrases or clauses is being given equal rhetorical weight and independence. One idea is not being signaled out as the main one, with the other clauses coming in as supporting or parenthetical information. If all that sounds horribly abstract and confusing, I have a really cheesy basic example. So here's an example of 3 ideas communicated paratactically, 3 independent clauses connected with the coordinating conjunction and. I went into the room and I picked up the book, and the book was read. Now, we could easily express all of those ideas in a single sentence with a little grammatical meddling. For example, you could say, I went into the room to get the read book. Or you could say, the book I went into the room to get was read. Or you could say, I got the read book when I went into the room. So the same stuff is happening in all 4 of those examples. The same information is being relayed, but in the last 3 examples, there's some interpretation happening. For example, in the first one, I went into the room to get the read book. Not only is me going into the room the main part of that sentence, you can't just say to get the read book and have it make sense, but also we have now the suggestion of a cause or an intent. Why did you go into the room? Well, it was to get the book. In the second example, the book that I went into the room to get was read. Prioritizes the readness of the book, and the that I went into the room to get is a subordinate clause. Subordinate grammatically in that it can't stand on its own and be its own idea, but because language is one representation of thought, it's also now, in a way, conceptually subordinate. Me entering the room and taking possession of the book now becomes extra, sort of unnecessary information. So one of the main effects of a paratactic style, and this, by the way, shows up in all kinds of languages and cultures globally. It's not just an English or even a European thing. One of the effects is to put a lot of that interpretive work on the audience, the reader or listener. I found this very exciting for 2 reasons. Number 1, it fits in just so nicely with the conceit of the frame narrative and the idea of religion being such a hands-off affair in Middle-earth, to the point where it would be considered a little presumptuous, perhaps, even for the Valar themselves to put too much of their own interpretation on what exactly the creation of the world signifies and what the intent of it is. Presumably, the elves at least probably argue amongst themselves all the time esoterically about what they think it means, but if we accept that this is the account the elves received from the Valar and are now passing on to their human allies and is then being preserved through generations, then you can imagine all of our narrators and authors and scribes and so forth saying, look, I know what I think it means, but all we know for sure is that this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened.
There was Eru the One, and he made first the Ainur, and he spoke to them, and they sang before him, and he was glad. Why did he do it? Why did they do it? Did any of them know what they were doing? What did they know? When did they know? How did they feel about it? We don't know. Our elven authors are like, that question is beyond my pay grade. I'm not going to risk talking about something I know nothing about and then having that potential error be enshrined throughout the centuries. So a very sort of pleasing humility. But secondly, and even more excitingly, is the fact that in a piece of writing, a prose poem, if you will, that is about collaborative subcreation, even the style of rhetoric used is inviting collaborative subcreation, just on the linguistic level. Each reader has to decide for themselves where they're going to place the emphasis, what conclusions they're going to draw, and everyone's going to do that a little bit differently, which is, of course, like the whole point of the Ainulindalë. So that tickled me. Next, I tried to look at how the Ainulindalë functioned as a creation myth or an origin myth, and how it might stack up against more naturally occurring, I guess you could say, similar myths. Once more, disclaimer, I'm not an expert. This is not comprehensive or even particularly rigorous. This is just a couple of things that popped out at me. There are a couple of parallels specifically with some versions of Norse origin myths. Obviously, the name Ilúvatar, translated as Allfather, calls to mind Odin, who has the same title. But also, in Norse mythology, there's this gap or void or emptiness that the world emerges out of. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but Ginnunga gap. And that wasn't something that I found commonly emphasized in other stories. Sometimes there's an unspoken assumption that first of all, there was nothing, and then there was something, and then that something began to take form. But generally, the narrative tends to start with the shaping of some sort of raw material into the world and cosmos that the audience would recognize. And there's less of an emphasis on how that raw material came into being in the first place. And also of note is that in Norse mythology, the void and the emptiness persists. And so also in Tolkien, there still are places of emptiness and nothingness, even once the world has been created. There are obviously plenty of biblical parallels in the content, notably the idea that comes up in Genesis and elsewhere, kind of sprinkled throughout the Old Testament, of some kind of heavenly council. There's only one true source of absolute divinity, but there are other beings or intelligences somehow with him. Like, scholars will point out that God will just talk sometimes in the Bible like he's addressing others who are there with him. And later this sense gets fleshed out into the idea of angels and hierarchies thereof. And here, of course, we have the Ainur in a literal choir. One important difference, though, is that, at least in the first chapter of Genesis, there's a very structured time frame. This is the reason given for why the week is 7 days long. It's because that reflects the 7 days or stages of creation, and they build one on another. Whereas in the Ainulindalë, it's much more timeless. All this stuff is sort of happening, and we don't really know how long each stage took, or even whether it's right to conceptualize it as occurring in sequence and taking time. A lot of creation myths have some sort of collaborative element to them, very frequently some sort of male-female symbolism going on. The Greeks have Gaia and Uranus, the feminine earth and the masculine sky, and they come together to create the Titans. The Titans pair off and have kids, and then we get the Olympians, and then the Olympians start to organize specific elements of creation. Some Mesopotamian myths have a similar dynamic going on. And here, the collaboration is between some indefinite, but one gets the sense that it's a rather large number of spirits and intelligences interacting with each other from a single source. So it is collaborative, but there's not as much reliance on any sort of sex, birth, procreation metaphor, Finally, I found that a lot of myths seem more concerned and occupied with the idea of dividing the chaos that is the raw material of existence into some kind of organized, meaningful structure. We get that a little bit here in that Ea and Arda are globed and sitting like little bubbles in the big scary void. So this is a very common motif. You have to somehow fence or encircle existence to get it to make sense and really to get it to exist. But the Ainulindalë is less a story about chaos moving into order, and more a story about filling nothingness with an increasing number of new things. And there's a quote I stumbled across a while ago regarding Morgoth as sort of the embodiment of destruction and chaos, with the remark that even if he had everything his own way and he destroyed as much as he could, yes, he'd be left with a formless chaos, but that formless chaos would still have in it the potential for new things to be brought forth from it. It would still exist independently of Morgoth, and that wouldn't satisfy him. It would drive him crazy. So the villain here is not really a force of chaos, he's a force of nothingness. His goal isn't to disrupt order, it's to undo creation. And that's the last thing I want to point out, is that very often there's some sort of story of a primal conflict, frequently generational conflict. The new gods have to rise against the old gods, and then one group triumphs over the other and takes control. So obviously we get a primal conflict. We have the warring themes. But when the music is over, neither side really knows how things are going to end for them. I mean, everyone obviously recognizes that Eru's in charge, but Eru was never the one involved in the fighting to begin with. And Melkor and Manwë are both allowed to enter Arda, along with however many of their friends they want to bring along with them. And the primal conflict continues. In one sense, it's still going on even in Lord of the Rings, and the outcome is still very much in doubt. So all in all, these are some of the traits, I think, that make the Ainulindalë what it is, make it feel very distinct and original, but at the same time recognizable. It makes sense. You can engage with it the same way you would engage with any number of other stories in the same genre, if you will. He's taken a bunch of familiar elements and rearranged them to give us something that we know how to approach, but something that's also a very new and fresh experience. And I think that's a big contributor to why this is so successful with readers.